Hi YouTube, welcome to my channel, Tempered Glass. In this video, I'll be cleaning my graphics card, which I haven't cleaned in quite a while, in order to see if it improves performance in any way. The graphics card which I'm using right now, I really haven't cleaned it in some time, ever since I got it. I got it this year, around April, and since then, I haven't really done anything to it. I actually got the graphic card used, and when I got it, it was in a pretty decent condition. It wasn't really damaged, it was very clean, but it's still using the stock thermal paste and it's still using the stock thermal pads. And since I've been using it, it has collected quite a bit of dust, especially because I don't use the side panel, the tempered glass side panel on my PC. I just leave it off for certain reasons. So today what we're gonna do is we're gonna clean the graphic card and we're gonna see if it gives us better performance in games. Before we do anything, I should point out that I don't necessarily care about playing my games at the highest graphics, and I don't necessarily want to get the highest performance from the graphic card. I like to play my games at 60 FPS, 1080p, medium settings, medium to high settings. That's good enough for me. And I'm not really interested in RTX at this point either. I feel like in a couple of years, maybe when a lot more games implement RTX, it's gonna be a lot better. The games are gonna look nicer. It's gonna make more sense to use RTX. But for now, it's not really an issue for me. I'm just gonna check and see if cleaning the graphic card and replacing the thermal paste and replacing the thermal pads improves performance, raw performance in general. But I just intend to play my games at 1080p 60 FPS. By the way, if you're wondering what GPU I use right now, the GPU which I use is a RTX 2060 non-super. It's a RTX 2060 6GB edition. It's a decent graphic card. It's able to play most games at 1080p 60 FPS high settings. I recently played Metro Exodus using this GPU, and I really didn't. Metro Exodus Enhanced Edition using this graphic card, and I really didn't run into any issues. Okay, so before we begin, the first thing I'm gonna do is clean my desk. Alright. Now that I've cleaned the desk up in order to make room so that I can work on the graphic card without things getting in the way, let's first take the graphic card out of the PC. I do apologize, my PC is a bit dusty. I do need to clean my whole PC up, but in this video, I'm not going to be doing that. All I'm going to do in this video is just clean my graphic card. But I do plan on cleaning my PC soon. Long overdue. I have to do this. My PC hasn't been cleaned in a while. The CPU fan cooler, the heatsink, is full of dust. It's just chock full of dust. So in order to remove the graphic card, first thing you would need to do is unplug your cable connecting the power supply to the graphic card. Make sure to also unscrew the graphic card from the back of the motherboard. It's usually held in place by 2 or 3 screws, depending on how thick your graphic card is. In my case, and in most cases, it should only be like 2 screws holding the GPU in place. The next thing you would need to do is, there's like a latch that holds the graphic card in place onto the motherboard, and you're going to need to press that latch in order to unclamp the graphic card from the motherboard. Don't make the mistake that I did. Make sure to unplug the cables from behind the graphic card before you remove it from the motherboard. Look at how dusty the graphic card is, the back plate. It's just full of dust. I have a microfiber cloth. I'm gonna use it to just remove the dust off of the GPU real quick. Just look at how dirty my PC case is. It's just full of dust. Thankfully, I have a microfiber cloth, and I'm going to use it in order to clean up any of the dust at the bottom. This should be good enough for now. But like I've said, I'm not actually going to be cleaning my PC in this video. I'm going to be saving that for the next video. I think that's too much work. In this video, I'm just going to be cleaning my graphic card. Okay, YouTube. Now that I've removed the graphic card from my PC, I'm going to take it apart and wow, look at this. It's full of dust. It is full of dust. I'm not sure if you guys can see this. By the way, I've been having some issues with autofocus on my camera. It's a decent camera. It's a mirrorless DSLR camera. I've been having some issues. What I've done is, I've noticed that I had these issues in the past few videos, and I wasn't sure why. I was trying different things. I was trying different autofocus modes. I was trying different modes out, and from time to time this issue would pop up. And it was really frustrating because I didn't really want to reshoot the whole video because of this. I've updated the firmware in the camera and also the firmware for the lens of the camera. That's a thing. Lens has its own firmware apparently. And I hope this issue doesn't happen anymore. Anyway, so take a look at all this dust on this GPU. Look at that. So when I purchased this GPU, I said I purchased it used. So when I purchased this GPU, it didn't really have this issue of dust, because the previous owner had kept it in a really good condition. In fact, I got the original box for it. I got the bill. It's still under warranty apparently. So everything with this GPU is good. It's just become a little dusty, and that's perfectly fine. It's normal for graphic cards to collect, for the heatsink on the GPU to collect dust, basically. Also, from what I know, this graphic card still has the stock thermal pads and the stock thermal paste. So in this video, I'm going to be doing 3 things to this GPU. First thing, I'll be taking it apart and cleaning it, just cleaning it. The second thing I'll do is, I'll replace the stock original thermal pads with brand new thermal pads that I purchased off of Amazon. I bought like 3 different thermal pads of 3 different thicknesses: 1.5 millimeter, 2 millimeter, and 2.5 millimeter thickness. And I paid good money for these thermal pads. I bought a brand called Gillette. Each of these thermal pads cost me close to like $15 to $20 each one of these packets. So I bought 3 of them, and it's supposed to be decent thermal pad. Actually, there was even more expensive thermal pad, but I really didn't want to overspend. There was even cheaper thermal pad, but I didn't want to buy the cheapest thermal pad, the most generic thermal pad. I wanted a decent thermal pad for a good price, and I bought 3 different thicknesses because different positions on the graphic card, the heatsink at different positions has different amounts of thickness, like different amounts of like space in between the heatsink itself and the memory that it's supposed to be absorbing heat from. The third thing that I'm going to do to the graphic card is replace the thermal paste. So as far as I know, the GPU still uses stock thermal paste, and the previous owner probably really hasn't changed it or done anything to it. So what I'll do is, I will replace the thermal paste with a little bit better thermal compound. The brand of thermal compound I decided to purchase is also from Gillette. This thermal compound claims to be a lot better. There were so many brands of thermal compound on like Amazon that I came across. In fact, I still have a previous stick of Arctic Silver MX4 thermal compound that I haven't finished yet. It's still there. I could use that. But I've been wanting to try different brands. I don't really think that the difference is that much. It may be of 1 or 2 degrees at most. I also am not interested or planning on ever using the liquid metal thermal compound. I feel like that particular type of thermal compound, the liquid metal one, is not really for me. It's not for a person like me because it's not easy to use. You could end up damaging your component if you don't know how to apply it properly. And from videos that I watched on YouTube of people using liquid metal thermal compound, after a while, after like a year and a half or so, the metal contact on the GPU or the CPU and the heatsink, the metal contact tends to erode. It erodes if you use the liquid metal thermal compound. I think people in some forums may say, oh, you could use a heatsink that's made of, I think, copper or nickel, it's fine. Aluminum is not good with a liquid metal thermal compound. It tends to react. To me, it really doesn't matter. I don't want to use liquid metal. I think it could give me a huge improvement in temperatures, but it's just not worth the damage it could do to my graphic card, to the heatsink, or to the surface of the graphic card die, and possibly even because liquid metal is electrically conductive, unlike normal thermal compound, it could end up short-circuiting the GPU and frying it completely, and I don't want to take that risk. Of course, it only happens if you apply it improperly and if the liquid metal thermal compound leaks onto your components on the GPU PCB, but I don't want to take the risk. I don't think I am that good at applying thermal compound. I mean, I basically just put a pea-sized amount and I just squish it on there. That makes the most sense to me. In order to clean this graphics card, what we need to do is to take it apart. The way I'm going to take this apart is, the first thing I'm going to do is, I'm going to remove the fan shroud off of the heatsink on the graphic card. On this particular GPU, the fan shroud is held in place via these 4 screws. It's different for different GPUs. Your GPU might not be the same as mine, but the general idea is the same. I've taken apart quite a few graphic cards in my time. Previously, I was using a RX 580 GPU in my PC. The RX 580, I used that GPU for like 5 years. I still have it. It still works. Wow, look at how much dust this fan shroud has. It's just full of dust. I haven't cleaned this thing in months, so it isn't surprising that there's a lot of dust on the heatsink. The next thing I'm gonna do is remove the fans off of the heatsink. The fans are held in place each fan is held in place via 3 screws. So a total of 6 screws for the fans. Be careful, by the way. Make sure to check for any cables that might be connecting the fans to the PCB of the graphics card. Make sure you don't pull them so that they don't break. You can just unplug the fans from the fan header on the GPU's PCB. I should mention that while doing this, while taking apart this GPU, I'm gonna be wearing this N95 mask. I got this specifically for this purpose because I don't want to breathe in the fine dust while cleaning this graphic card, because the fine dust, it goes into your lungs, and for me, I don't know about anyone else, but for me, if I were to breathe this in, I would have headaches, I would feel lethargic. Every time I clean my PC, like in the past, I make the mistake of not wearing a mask. And sometimes I may breathe this dust in, and it's just not good. So make sure that you have like a an N95 mask or something so that you don't breathe this fine dust in, because it's not really good for your health. You'll end up getting lung problems, I assume. Be careful with the screws, you don't want to lose them. Also, try to make sure that you keep the screws along with the thing that you unscrewed it from. Make sure you have an idea of which screw goes where. Fan screws are fan screws, so like generally speaking, it doesn't matter if the fan is a left fan or a right fan or what the size of the fan is. All the fan screws are the same. Even if you mix them up, it's not really a big deal. But try to make sure that the screws for the shroud and the screws for the fans are not being mixed up. This heatsink is caked full of dust. I wonder how much cooler the GPU is going to run once I remove all this dust off of the heatsink. Just look at the amount of dust on the heatsink. I really haven't done any maintenance on this thing ever since I received it back in around April of this year, 2022. I can't wait to see what the difference in temperature is. Once I clean this thing, I replace the thermal pads and the thermal paste. Now that we've removed the fan shroud and the fans themselves, next thing I want to do is remove the heatsink off of the PCB. The heatsink is screwed onto the PCB, it's held in place, and I want to remove the heatsink so that I can properly clean the heatsink and wipe the PCB of any dust. In order to remove the heatsink off of the PCB on this GPU, or I guess on any GPU, I'm not really sure, but on this GPU, the heatsink is held in place via these screws that you can unscrew on the back of the GPU, where the back plate is. Be careful with these 4 screws in the center of the GPU, by the way, because these 4 screws, they're pressing the heatsink under the die of the GPU. Don't unscrew one single screw at a time. Instead, what you should do is unscrew each of the screws a little by little in a crisscross pattern. This way, one portion of the die, of the GPU die, doesn't get a lot of the pressure, and the pressure is evenly distributed. Even when you're screwing this heatsink back on to the PCB, make sure you screw it back on in a crisscross pattern. Now the heatsink should just come right off. Wow, look at how dusty the heatsink is. I'm not going to clean the heatsink just yet. I want to remove the backplate first. That's what we're going to do next. That's the last thing we need to remove, the backplate. Now that the heatsink is off, this is what the PCB looks like. The square in the middle, the one that's covered in thermal paste, that's the GPU die. On this particular GPU, the way you remove the backplate is, I've noticed, you need to unscrew and remove the heatsink first, and then and only then can you remove the backplate, because the screws for the backplate are on the front of the PCB. On my RX 580, if you want to remove the backplate, the screws holding the backplate onto the back of the GPU were at the back of the GPU itself, so I didn't really have to remove the heatsink for that GPU. I'm only pointing this out because it really doesn't make a difference how or where the screws are. different graphic cards are different, they're designed differently. I just wanted to point that out. Different GPUs might be different. On your GPU, the screws holding the backplate onto the GPU might not be in the front. They might be at the back itself. It might be a little bit easier for you to remove the backplate. But then if you wanted to remove the heatsink, you may need to remove the backplate first, because the screws for the heatsink might be hiding under the backplate. I'm just gonna unscrew these screws real quick, holding the backplate in. And there we go. Look at how much dust was there behind the GPU. I have a microfiber cloth. I'm gonna use it to wipe this dust off of the GPU. I also have a old toothbrush, and I use this toothbrush specifically for cleaning PC parts. And then wipe all the dust off the back of the GPU using this microfiber cloth. I should mention that before I took apart this graphics card, I actually did run some tests to see what the temperatures were, because I'm going to do a before and after comparison. I don't think the temperatures are bad, but I think they could be better. I don't necessarily play games beyond 60 FPS at 1080p, so I usually turn on VSync, and due to this, in most games, or in basically every single game that I play, my frame rates are always capped at 60 FPS. At this point, I'm not really interested in going above that, so I don't necessarily tend to stress my GPU out a lot. Doesn't matter what GPU I use. I prefer playing at a fixed 60 FPS. It doesn't really make a difference for me, but I did run some tests in a game, and when I was doing these tests, I actually turned off VSync so that the frames could go as high as possible, just so I could measure how hot the GPU would get. And it did get pretty hot. Graphically, the game wasn't suffering. I wasn't experiencing too many frame drops, but I'm sure that if I cleaned this GPU up and ran the same tests again, I would probably get more performance and lower temperatures. The video game that I'm talking about that I ran tests on using this GPU before I took it apart is Sleeping Dogs. I specifically used this game because it's a rather old game, but it's not too old. It's about 10 to 8 years old. I ran tests on Sleeping Dogs Definitive Edition. I'm gonna include all I'm gonna include the comparison towards the end of this video. But generally speaking, cleaning your GPU is never a bad thing. You have only to gain by cleaning your GPU. You'll probably have a lower temperature and higher performance if you after a while, if you replaced your stock thermal paste and the stock thermal pads with something slightly better. This thermal paste is kind of hard. Like, it's not mushy, so I can tell that it hasn't been changed in a while. Finally, I get to clean the heatsink. I saved the best for last. Technically, I still have the fans and the fan shroud remaining. While doing this, I am wearing the N95 mask I mentioned earlier because I don't want to breathe in any of this dust. Okay guys, I cleaned the whole GPU. I've cleaned the GPU PCB, the backside of the PCB, the heatsink. I even cleaned these the fan shroud and the fans themselves. I did this off camera. I cleaned each blade carefully using the microfiber cloth. I just wiped them to make sure, because they were covered in dust. Like there was a thin layer of dust on every single blade on both the fans, and I cleaned them, and I cleaned the fan shroud. The fan shroud had dust in between these cracks and edges, these nooks and crannies. So now that that's out of the way, the last thing I have left to do is replace the thermal pads and apply new thermal paste. I cannot wait to try the new thermal pads. Okay YouTube, now that I've cleaned up the GPU and the heatsink, I'm gonna apply brand new thermal pads to the graphics card. What I did was I actually measured the fresh brand new thermal pad. I lined it up against the existing thermal pad, the stock ones, and I measured them. I measured the thickness. This is exactly flush. This 2mm one is exactly flush with the blue one. What I found was basically that these blue ones are 2mm thick. This green one here is 1.5mm thick, because when I line this up against the green one, the green thermal pad here is just a little bit thinner than this, and it lines up perfectly with this one. This is 1.5mm. Now I also have a 2.5mm thick thermal pad, but I'm not going to be using this because I don't think I need this at the moment. But I'm glad I have it anyway, because you never know, I may want to change the thermal pad on a different graphic card at some point. On the Amazon page, they had thermal pads of even more thicknesses, like 3mm, 1mm, I think 0.5mm. I didn't go for those. I went with these ones because I felt like these ones were the most, I didn't think that I would need a much thicker thermal pad, like a 3mm thick thermal pad. So I didn't buy those. Okay, so before I changed thermal pads, I just want to point something out, something interesting that I just found out. So you guys can see this blue thermal pad up here, right? It goes onto these memory chips. Each one of this is 1GB. So this is a 6GB GPU. This is a RTX 2060 6GB edition. So there's like 4 RAM chips here and 6. So that's a total of 6GB. What I noticed was this thing here, this thermal pad here, this blue one that I'm pointing at, it goes on this side. You can see there are no RAM chips here because there are different variations of the same GPU. Some of them have, I guess, 8GB or 12GB. I know there's like a different variation of this same model of GPU, but the company, the factory, they've added a thermal pad here. It lines up perfectly. Basically what I'm saying is that this thermal pad does not make contact with these two RAM chips slots here, because they really haven't added any RAM chips. So what I'll be doing is I'll be taking this stock thermal pad and I'll just be throwing it away. Oh wow, look at that. Look at the dust that's on here. So I'll be throwing it away. I'm not going to add fresh thermal. I'm going to add fresh thermal pad for this section. If this model of GPU had RAM sticks here, or RAM chips here, then I probably would add the thermal pad. You don't have to do it like me, but I'm just going to do it this way. Another thing I've noticed is this line of thermal pad, this thin line that goes onto this bulge, there's like this protrusion of heatsink. Basically what I'm trying to say is that this thermal pad here, this line of thermal pad, it goes and it's supposed to touch these 4 chips. You can see these 4 chips here. Actually, there are supposed to be more than 4, but on this model of GPU, they haven't added any. These chips here, this line here, that's what the thermal pad is for. The thermal pad is not for these black capacitors. These are capacitors. You don't really need to use thermal pads on them. You only use them on the chips, I guess. I'm sure the capacitors also generate heat, a little bit of heat, but not as much as the RAM sticks would do. These red circles are also capacitors. These black circles are also capacitors. I don't know what these chips are for. They're definitely not for RAM. These ones are for RAM. These ones are for something else, but my point is this. You can clearly see on this thermal compound there are like 4 indentations. 1, 2, 3, 4, and this whole line down here, there's no indentations here. That means that this portion of the thermal pads, they're completely useless. You don't really need this much thermal pad for this section of the GPU. So what I'll do is, I'll take this much brand new 2mm thermal pads and I'll put it onto these 4 chips here, because that's the only thing that needs a thermal pad. I really don't need thermal pad for this section up here, because there's no chips here. There's no chips on these 4 slots here. I'll only take about this much brand new thermal pad, and I will put it on to this 4 chips, because this goes like this. These 2 green thermal pads, the ones up here, they connect with these 2 chips up here. There's like this one black chip you can see, and this one here. So this and this one. That's what you need the green, that's what these green thermal pads are for. Since these green thermal pads are 1.5 millimeters thick, I'm gonna be using the 1.5 millimeter thick thermal pad for these 2 chips. These 2. Okay, I got a pair of scissors. First I'm gonna begin with these 4 RAM chips up here. I'm gonna take this and I will throw it away. I've cut roughly the amount of thermal compound, or rather thermal pad, that I'm gonna need for this section. I kinda messed up a little bit. This side is a bit longer than this side, or I should say broader. Nah, it's not a big deal. So there's like plastic on both sides. I'm gonna remove this plastic first and put it on. Perfect. So I kinda cut a little extra lengthwise, like it's a little longer, because I mean there's no point in saving a tiny amount of thermal pad. There's a little bit of residue from the previous thermal pad on these chips here. Next, what I'm gonna do is I'm gonna cut some thermal pads for these 2 chips. I think I'm gonna probably use up this whole block of thermal pad. I hope I have enough for this section here. Yeah, I should have enough. I should have more than enough. I'm gonna... Perfect. I'm not gonna be adding any thermal compound, or rather thermal pads, to these 2 RAM slots, because it's pointless. I'm also gonna remove this stock thermal pad, this one, because I no longer need it, and I'll throw this away. Look at the amount of dust it picked up along the edges. Next, I'm gonna cut out some more thermal pads, some more thermal pad for those 4 chips here. I'm only gonna cut this much, not any more, because this whole section goes to waste. I really don't need such a long line, such a large amount of thermal pad. Look at how much dust it's picked up. It's picked up a lot of dust. Also, these are the stock thermal pads. I don't think they're bad. I don't think the new G-Lid thermal pads are any better. They're probably a little better. They're probably going to perform a little better, but performance-wise, I think the improvement is probably going to be minor. There's definitely going to be an improvement though. Probably just a few degrees. I'm really eyeballing it, by the way. Yeah, I think this should be enough. I'll take a little bit more. I actually think I got too much of it. There's a little extra that's covering the fifth slot here, but there's no chip on that. It's not really a big issue. Perfect, there we go. Next thing I want to do this real quick is get the 1.5mm thermal pads, two of them, two small bits of it, for these two chips up here. Because the 1.5mm, that's the green one here, that's the green one, it goes onto those chips on top. They've added a lot more than necessary from the factory. I'm gonna just remove them, and there we go. I'll also clean this up because there's a lot of residue. I've added the thermal pads onto these two chips up here as well. For these two chips, I used 1.5mm thermal pads. If I'm being honest, I think I could have gotten away with using 2mm thermal pads as well. I don't think it really makes much of a difference. So now that I've applied fresh thermal pad onto this graphics card, the last thing I need to do is apply thermal paste. The thermal paste that I'm going to use for this GPU is also from G-Lid. I purchased this along with the thermal pads. There are so many brands of thermal paste in the market these days. There's like Cooler Master thermal paste. I didn't even know Cooler Master used to make thermal paste, but apparently they do. There's Corsair thermal paste. Anyway, I bought G-Lid. It wasn't too expensive. It was actually fairly cheaper than their thermal pads. I'm just gonna apply like a pea-sized amount. That should be enough. I know it looks like it's a lot, but actually it's not. It's not a lot. It's just a tiny amount. And when I squeeze the heatsink onto the GPU, it's just gonna spread out evenly. This thermal paste should be a little better than the stock thermal paste. I mean, I really don't think it is gonna make much of a difference. These days, even stock thermal paste is like not really that bad. But it should give me a few degrees Celsius improvement in temperature. Hold on. So I completely forgot to rescrew the backplate, because on this GPU, the screws for the backplate are on the PCB, on the front of the PCB, on the front of the graphic card, unlike my RX 580, and I almost put the heatsink back on. I'm gonna do this real quick. There are 5 screws for the backplate on this GPU. Different GPUs are different. There we go. That's the last of the backplate screws. I hope that's lined perfectly. I'm not really sure. Oh wow, it's not lined perfectly. Okay, I'm back. I actually had to rearrange all the thermal pads again. Oh, there we go. Perfect. This should be properly aligned. Okay, so let's screw the screws for the heatsink back in, and I hope the heatsink doesn't fall while I'm doing this. It fell! It fell! Let's try this one more time. There we go, perfect. So this time I'm not gonna put this down. I'm just gonna hold it in my hand like this. I'm not gonna tighten these screws at the back all at once. I'm just gonna put them in, and I'm gonna tighten them a little by little in a crisscross pattern, because I don't wanna put pressure on the GPU die. I've screwed all the screws back in. The only thing left to screw back in are the GPU fans and the GPU fan shroud. I'm going to screw the GPU fans in first, and then I'll screw in the GPU shroud. I've finished installing the fans as well as the GPU shroud back onto the GPU heatsink. Now the only thing that's left is to plug this graphics card back into the PC. Before I plug this graphics card back into the PC, I'm just gonna clean this back portion of the case. Just gonna wipe it with this microfiber cloth. Look at the amount of dust. Look at how much dust there is. There's a lot of dust. I'm not gonna clean this PC in this video. I'm gonna save that for the next video. I am planning on cleaning my PC at some point. It's really dusty, especially the CPU heatsink. Just look at how clean this graphic card is as compared to like when I took it out. It was just full of dust, and now it looks almost brand new, especially with the new thermal paste and the new thermal pads. I think there should definitely be an improvement when it comes to temperatures as well as performance in games. Okay, I'm gonna plug this in. So you want to make sure these GPU pins go into this PCI Express bracket onto the motherboard. This is the latch that latches onto this piece of plastic here. So when you plug this in, you're gonna hear a click noise. Let me see if yes, there we go. I plugged this GPU in. This isn't really a heavy GPU, but you want to make sure it doesn't sag. This is a fairly lightweight GPU, honestly, the RTX 2060, especially compared to my RX 580, the GPU which I was using before this. I'm gonna plug these screws in. Last thing I'm gonna do is plug the power cable back in. This GPU uses an 8-pin power cable. Alright, I'm gonna set my desk up again, put all the monitors back, put everything back, and then I'm gonna turn this PC on. See how it performs. I put the graphics card back into the PC, and I set my desktop back up. I reinstalled the monitors and everything, and I decided to run a few tests on my graphics card. I wanted to see what the temperatures would be before cleaning the graphics card and replacing the thermal paste and thermal pad, and after doing all those things. In order to measure the temperature, I used a software called Hardware Info, HW Info. It's a pretty well-known software. If you've probably heard about it, and you probably have it installed on your PC right now. If you don't know what HW Info is, you can just download it. It gives you very detailed information about all the components in your computer, such as your CPU voltage, CPU core, the frequency of each of the cores, the temperature for your CPU, your RAM voltage, your RAM frequency, your GPU voltage, GPU frequency, GPU fan speed, your CPU fan speed, the fan speed in your motherboard fan speed, provided that your fans are connected to the fan header on your motherboard. It gives you all kinds of information. So that's the software I used. I measured both the idle temperature before cleaning and after cleaning, as well as the temperature of the GPU under stress before I cleaned it and after. And here are the results. The GPU idle temperature before cleaning was 38.3 degrees Celsius. The GPU hotspot temperature before cleaning on idle was 53.7 degrees Celsius. The GPU hotspot temperature refers to the temperature at the GPU die itself, where all the CUDA cores are located. You can get more detailed information about what GPU hotspot temperature is, I guess, if you Google it. After I cleaned the graphics card, here are the idle temperatures that I got for the GPU. 35.5 degrees Celsius for the GPU on idle after cleaning, and 51.3 degrees Celsius for the GPU hotspot on idle after cleaning. Clearly there has been a reduction in temperature before and after cleaning. The reduction is not really that big. It's a 2 degrees Celsius drop in temperature on idle, which isn't much. But the real difference, and I'm about to tell you what the numbers are, the real difference was when I put the GPU under stress. Before I go into detail about what the temperatures are for the GPU while under stress, before and after cleaning, let me tell you how I put the GPU under stress. What I did was I played a game. I mentioned this earlier in the video. The game that I played in order to stress the GPU is called Sleeping Dogs. I could have used any game. I could use Metro Last Light. It's a very decent game, but I decided to go with Sleeping Dogs. I feel like a game like Sleeping Dogs would be an accurate representation of the real world performance that you can expect from cleaning a GPU such as the RTX 2060, which is not really that old, but it's not really a powerful GPU, and it's kind of it's a couple of years old at this point. The RTX 2060 does have ray tracing, and Sleeping Dogs doesn't really have ray tracing, but I don't really care too much about ray tracing at this point. By the way, I also measured the frames per second for Sleeping Dogs. Basically, I ran a benchmark while I was playing the game in order to measure the average FPS. I did this both before cleaning the graphics card and after cleaning the graphics card. In order to run a benchmark on the game, I used MSI Afterburner. MSI Afterburner in conjunction with Riva Tuner Statistics. Riva Tuner Statistics is an app, it's a program that pulls information from MSI Afterburner and it displays it on your monitor while you're in the game. If you've ever watched videos on YouTube of graphic comparisons, like videos where the video compares a RTX 3080 Ti with a 6900 XT, you'll often find information being displayed on screen, like the FPS, temperature, frequency, stuff like that. That can be done using Riva Tuner in conjunction with MSI Afterburner. So MSI Afterburner has an inbuilt benchmarking tool. Sleeping Dogs also has its own benchmarking. It has its own benchmarking tool, but I decided not to run it because I felt like I wanted a more real world kind of benchmark, which is why I always prefer using MSI Afterburner's inbuilt benchmarking tool. So you can set a hotkey for the benchmarking thing, and you can turn the benchmark on and off while you're playing the game. And I feel like this gives you a more accurate representation of what kind of frames per second to expect. So before I cleaned the GPU, what I did was I turned on Sleeping Dogs. I played the game for about 45 minutes or so just to let the graphics card warm up. After about 45 minutes or so, I used the hotkey to turn on the MSI benchmarking tool, and so it starts displaying all the information using Riva Tuner on the screen, like the average FPS or so. And I just continued to play the game for another 1.5 hours to 2 hours. So I did this after I cleaned the graphics card, replaced the thermal paste, and replaced the thermal pads as well. I did the exact same thing. I played the game for roughly 45 minutes or so to let the GPU warm up. Then while I was in the game, I turned on the MSI Afterburner benchmarking thing, and I continued to play the game for about 2 hours. This is what I got. Here are the results. Before cleaning the graphics card, I got an average of 72 FPS on Sleeping Dogs. After cleaning the graphics card, replacing the thermal paste, and replacing the thermal pads, I was able to get 78 FPS on Sleeping Dogs. That's a 6 FPS improvement. Now, I know it doesn't sound like a lot, 6 FPS. I was kind of expecting a little bit more maybe, but once I tell you the difference in temperature while I was playing this game, you'll see why actually this is a decent improvement. Like, it's not a bad improvement. An improvement of 6 FPS is not necessarily bad. I should point out, by the way, that on Sleeping Dogs, I had all my graphics settings turned to max. All the graphics settings were turned to max. Motion blur was turned off, and VSync, vertical synchronization, was turned off. VSync basically caps, it limits your FPS to a certain amount based on the refresh rate of your monitor. So say you have a monitor that has a refresh rate of 60 Hz, if you turn on VSync, it's going to limit your FPS to 60 Hz, because what VSync is trying to do is every time your monitor refreshes itself, the game refreshes itself. So a 60 Hz monitor with VSync turned on is going to give you 60 FPS in any game that's capable of being run at 60 FPS. I turned VSync off because I didn't want my FPS to be limited to 60. I wanted to see how far I could go, like how much frames per second I could get at the maximum graphical settings with this GPU. And so as I mentioned, I got 72 FPS before cleaning and 78 FPS roughly. This is just a rough average after cleaning the GPU. Okay, so let's talk about what the temperatures were like while the GPU was under load. So while I was playing Sleeping Dogs, Hardware Info was open and it was doing its thing. It was measuring the temperature of the graphics card, and I played in both instances, both before and after cleaning the graphics card. I played the game for like a good 2 or 3 hours. So Hardware Info had ample time to get an accurate reading of the temperature of the GPU. Here are the results I was able to get from Hardware Info. Bear in mind that these are just averages. It's not really it's not meant to be perfect, but it's as close to, the readings are as close to perfect as you can get. This is not a controlled environment by any means. These measurements were taken on different days. On certain days the AC was turned on certain days it was just super cold, so I don't really use an AC. This is meant to give you a rough idea of what you should expect if you do something similar to your graphics card. So while the GPU was under stress before cleaning, the GPU temperature was 75.8 degrees Celsius. The GPU hotspot temperature before cleaning under stress was 94.4 degrees Celsius. 94.4 degrees Celsius, that's the GPU hotspot temperature. It's a lot. It's really high. And I don't think you should worry about such high GPU hotspot temperatures, by the way. The GPU hotspot is the core itself, the die of the GPU itself. So it does tend to run a little hot on certain high-end graphics cards. The GPU hotspot temperature can go over 100 degrees Celsius. It can get really high. So it's not really that bad, but still 94.4 degrees Celsius is a lot, and if I can reduce it, if I can lower it, that's not a bad thing. That's always a good thing. I remember reading about the Radeon 7 GPUs from a few years ago. This was the graphic card that AMD produced before they began making their XT series of GPUs. This was their Vega series of GPUs, like Radeon 7 Vega something. They didn't really do that well, I think, and they tended to run quite hot. I was reading about Radeon 7, and Radeon 7, the hotspot temperature for that graphics card would go all the way up to like over 100 degrees Celsius. But of course, AMD GPUs are not the only ones that have such high hotspot temperatures. It can happen with NVIDIA GPUs as well. If you have a 3080 Ti or 2080 Ti, it can get really, really hot. From reading about this, I don't think that a hotspot temperature is something you should worry about. So let me tell you about what happened after I cleaned the GPU and what are the temperatures like for this GPU under stress. So after cleaning the graphics card, the GPU temperature while under stress was 69.4 degrees Celsius. That's a significant drop. Earlier, as I mentioned, it was 75.8. That's a roughly 6 degrees Celsius drop in temperature. That's not bad by any means. And the GPU hotspot temperature after cleaning while under stress was 87.5 degrees Celsius. That's a 7 degrees Celsius drop in temperature. So a few moments ago, when I said that I got 6 FPS more in Sleeping Dogs after cleaning the graphics card, it may not seem like much, 6 FPS more, but the fact that not only was I able to get 6 FPS more while at the same time having lower overall temperatures for my graphics card, I think that's a good thing. I was able to achieve the higher performance while maintaining a lower temperature on the GPU overall. I think the results are really good. A 6 to 7 degrees Celsius drop in GPU temperature and also the hotspot temperature while gaining some performance in a video game, that's actually very good. I would like to point out that normally when I'm playing video games, I like to turn VSync on. I don't really like to go over 60 FPS. Maybe in the future I would love to play at 120 FPS, 1080p, or even 120 FPS 4K. I think that would be absolutely amazing. But at this point, I like to play at a consistent 60 FPS, 1080p. And I like to have VSync turned on. So honestly, most of the time, I'm not even stressing the GPU out that much. I think that cleaning the GPU and replacing the thermal paste as well as the thermal pads on your graphics card can lead to longer lifespan for that GPU. Okay YouTube, that's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed this video. I'm definitely looking forward to making more videos with my PC in the future soon. I think my next video is going to be me cleaning the entire PC, especially the CPU heatsink, the CPU fan, because it's just full of dust and I really need to clean it. It's been a long time. It's been months since I cleaned it, and because as I mentioned, I don't really keep the side panel on my GPU. I like to leave it off for certain reasons at this point. So a lot of dust tends to get inside. Thank you so much for watching. I will talk to you guys again very soon. Bye bye.